Good morning, everyone. It's Gary from Soccer Pro, and today I have Jordan Gardner with me from FC Helsinger, and we're going to be talking about how soccer players can make that jump from playing in the U.S. to getting overseas and playing in the European market. So welcome, Jordan. Glad to have you with us today. How about starting off and telling us a little bit more about you and your background?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me, Gary. So I'm an American executive investor. I have ownership stakes in a couple soccer clubs in Europe, including FC Helsinger in the Danish First Division. I also have some small minority stakes in other clubs in Europe, including Swansea City in the UK and Dundalk Football Club in the Republic of Ireland. I played soccer growing up, not quite to a professional level, but pretty close. And about 5 years ago, I transitioned to spending most of my time on European soccer. I'm obviously still very well connected with soccer in the United States. And I get asked a lot about, how can American players make that jump over to Europe, whether that's a youth player, whether that's a professional player, college player. So I think this would be a really interesting platform to kind of go through some of those steps, educate the audience a bit in terms of the challenges, whether it's, related to work permits, travel restrictions with COVID, the differences in the quality and level of play and all that kind of stuff. So happy to talk about all those kind of things.
All right, fantastic. Well, why don't we start at the beginning? What is the first thing that a player that's maybe in college or at the end of their high school career needs to start thinking about if they want to make that leap over into the European market?
Yeah, I think the first thing to think about is the level of play in Europe is very high. I think just being realistic to the American player, if you're a player that is not going to be on a track to be a professional player in the United States, whether that's an MLS or USL, it's highly, highly unlikely you'll be able to be a professional in Europe, just being realistic. I think the other thing most people need to know is that if you're under the age of 18, unless you have a European Union passport, you physically can't go there and sign a professional contract. You can go there for short periods of time and train, but you can only do that up to 3 months and you can't actually be in the country working. So I get a lot of parents say, hey, my 17-year-old at MLS Academy wants to come over. And I say, that's great. We can't even talk until the child is 18. If the player does have a European Union passport, they can move over at 16. So that's just something to be aware of. Beyond that, I think it's about making sure the maturity level of that player is pretty high. It's kind of very much a sink or swim landscape in European soccer. It can be very challenging. You have agents, you have different languages and cultures. There's a lot of different competing factors. So I think, of course, we're seeing the top young American players make these jumps to Europe and having a lot of success, but there's a lot of other Americans that try to make that jump and can't make it. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with playing college soccer or playing in the USL or staying in the US. So I think it's great for kids to be ambitious and have that goal of playing in Europe, but certainly it's not for everyone.
Now, these kids that are coming out of high school and thinking about a college pathway, is there an opportunity for them to get over into the European market, play at a high level, and go to college at the same time? Or are they at a decision point where they have to say, look, I'm either going to put off my education for a year or two and try this, or is there a way to do it at the same time?
Yeah, so you'll see a lot of college players go to Europe and train over the summer. They'll go maybe for 2, 3, 4 weeks and train with a club, and that's obviously very doable. The issue comes when a player potentially signs a professional contract, then they lose their college eligibility. Now, can they go back to school and finish their education? Of course they can. But in terms of continuing their college soccer career, that will end at that point. So it is a situation at that point where they have to make a decision, yes or no. And I think some college players are making that same decision when they decide if they're going to go to MLS or not. So it's a difficult decision, and certainly the level of play, being completely honest, between college soccer in the United States and almost all the European leagues, there's a pretty big gap there. But that's not to say there aren't some players who can make that jump.
But realistically, nobody's going to sign them to a pro contract unless they have a serious interest in them, right? They're not just going to bring them in and say, well, maybe we'll give it a try.
Yeah, you'll have agents that will often be kind of intermediaries trying to promote the players in Europe. Certainly if you have an All-American player who's the leading scorer in college soccer, presumably there's a level of play there enough that maybe a European club will want to look at that player. And then if the player impresses on trial, there could be a contract. So, I think you look at Daryl DK, who's now at Barnsley in Europe. He played 1 year at the University of Virginia, then turned pro and went to MLS, and now he's in Europe. So a little bit of a different path. It is very difficult to make that jump directly from, let's say, college soccer to Europe. Not impossible, but difficult.
So if we break it down into, let's say, more of the mechanics of how this actually takes place, what would be the first thing that someone should start doing? Who should they contact? Should they go through an agent? Are there pathways that you would recommend for making this progression into the European market?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on a lot of different variables in terms of the age, certainly the level of play of that particular player, the interest levels. I think there are some companies out there that facilitate Americans moving. They almost have schooling, and they put them up in these kind of somewhat semi-professional environments, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that's a pretty difficult pathway for a player to become a professional. I think if a player is good enough, they'll probably have to go through an agent, and that'll help facilitate a move to Europe. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways it could happen potentially. But of course, if the player is good enough, there's always going to be interest. I would say probably the number one most important thing is to understanding what market country makes the most sense. So let's just say if it's a player from Southern California who is Latino and speaks Spanish, maybe going to Spain or Portugal or one of those Southern European countries makes more sense. Maybe if it's a player for us, for instance, in Denmark, everyone speaks English in Denmark, so it's a relatively easy cultural integration. The UK, now you have issues with Brexit, so it's more difficult to get into the country. So understanding the market makes a lot of sense. I mean, in the past, we've seen a lot of Americans go to very, very low division teams in Scandinavia, Sweden, Denmark. Again, there's nothing wrong with that, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's a particularly strong pathway to become a top level professional player in Europe, just because it's just very difficult. Ultimately, it comes down to, is the player good enough?
Well, you keep bringing that up. I think that's a really important point. What are some of the traits that you're looking for in a player before you think that they're ready to make that transition?
I think a lot of it is physically and maturity level, especially when we're talking about 18 and 19-year-old kids. We've seen a lot of kids come over that might technically be good enough to play in Europe, but physically they're not there. I mean, you're playing against real men, and these are, this is their job. They have to protect their job to put food on the table. And so it can be really challenging, especially for young players physically. The winters, for instance, in Denmark are really, really difficult, and the cultural differences. So it can be very challenging for some of those players to make that jump. So I think maturity, both physically and mentally, is probably the most important thing.
So what are some of the success stories, though, of the players that you've seen come over? Who do you find is successful? Do you have any examples of players that you can point to and say, hey, this is a great player. He did this, he did that. He came over prepared in this way, and this is the success he achieved.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of examples. Obviously, Daryl DK was one I mentioned earlier. Christian Kappas is an interesting one. He's been on the under-23 national team. He was with, I want to say, FC Dallas's academy, and then he jumped over to Denmark at 18, and he was at a club called Hobro, which is in the Danish Superliga. And it took him about a year and a half where he wasn't playing a whole lot, really maturing and developing. And then the last year, he's done really well. And then he's about to make a move to Brøndby, which is one of the biggest clubs in Denmark, and he's only 21. So I think understanding that these moves take time, if you come over at 18, it might take 2, 3, 4 years for you as a player to mature to the level where you can really be consistently playing and moving up the food chain in European soccer. So I think that's an interesting example. I mean, there's, of course, obviously the top level players. We're seeing the top national team level players are moving over to Europe, Brendan Aronson, Pulisic, obviously. But I do think there is an opportunity for college level players, maybe MLS under 19 academy players who just aren't quite good enough for MLS to get into a European environment and mature over a period of time. But, it more often than not, it's a challenging environment, and a lot of kids don't make it, but that's the way it goes.
So what do you see as the primary differences between the players in the US and the players over in the European market?
It's a much more cutthroat environment in Europe. I mean, certainly with promotion and relegation, you have an environment where it's really challenging for the players week in, week out. They have to win games or else clubs get relegated and people lose their jobs and clubs go out of business, right? I think there's just such a cultural integration in the sport in many of the European countries where, again, in the US, soccer is gaining popularity, but it's clearly not there yet. And so if you go to places in Europe, it's soccer 100% of the time. It's entirely the focus of those local communities and those, turn on the television, all it is soccer. So just the immersion of the sport is pretty significant. The pressure that puts on players can be pretty significant.
Well, when you get into the youth markets here, we see a big base of players, but are we seeing them developing at the same level that they're developing the players at the same age group? So let's pull it back from the adult ages into, let's say, 10, 12, 14 years old. When you look at the development that's taking place here, or at least the development process that takes place here, are you seeing it comparable to what you're seeing over in Europe?
I think youth development in the United States is definitely improving, and we're seeing that with these young players coming through academies, moving on to Europe, mostly MLS academies. I still think it's a pretty far ways off. I mean, European clubs and academies have 50, 75 years in terms of infrastructure built up. They teach the game and they look at the game in a much more technical way. So I think we're catching up in the US, but we're still pretty far behind is the way I would put it. Again, it depends on the country and the club, but I think it'll be interesting to see at the next World Cup, the next 2 World Cups, how the US team does, because we're seeing this new batch of players who've come through North American academies, and we'll see how that looks. Clearly, there's not a critical mass like there is in Europe. There's just so many good players, but it's improving.
Well, it definitely is a situation where soccer is competing with a lot of other, let's say, primetime sports: baseball, football, basketball, hockey. Lacrosse has consumed a lot of athletes. So it is challenging for a country like the US to get their top athletes into the sport. When you start to look at the national team, are you seeing the approach to the game starting to reach parity, or are we still looking at things maybe from a more physical, less technical standpoint?
I think we're kind of at an inflection point where so many of our players are playing in the European environment where they are looking at the game in the more technical manner and becoming much more technically sound players. So I think over the next probably 1 or 2 World Cup cycles, we're going to see that transition. Hopefully, that's my hope. But I mean, look, the national team coach, Berhalter, he coached in Sweden. He was at Hammarby, which is a club in Scandinavia. Obviously, he's been in and around MLS as well. So again, I think it'll be interesting to see how that looks. And so I think it's probably too early to tell quite yet, but things are definitely changing in a positive direction, I think.
And what advice would you give someone, let's say in the 13, 14-year-old age range, that's really serious about soccer? And you say, hey, look, if you're at 14 years old or 13 years old and you want to get up to this level by the time you're 18 or 19, here are the things you need to be doing.
That's a good question, actually. I think it's about continually testing the players at the highest levels. So, that doesn't necessarily mean every single kid at 13 or 14 needs to be in an MLS academy, because not every MLS academy necessarily does a great job. But it's about making sure you're in the right environment. And again, I'm not here to say one academy does a good job or doesn't. Clearly, there's a wide range of the way people do things. I think what's probably important on a more day-to-day basis is for kids and their families to understand that it's a holistic view in terms of player development. It's not just I'm doing well on the field. Is it what is your nutrition? How are you taking care of your body? What is your mental well-being? Obviously, education comes into a piece of that, the kind of the soccer IQ aspect of it. So there's a lot more that goes into it than just like I'm getting better because I'm playing on good teams in an MLS academy on the pitch. So I think a little bit more of a holistic view. But beyond that, it's really about a waiting game and checking a lot of boxes and being patient and making sure the players are in the right environment. And then if they're in the right environment by 17, 18, 19, they take the next steps. And like player development is not necessarily a linear path, right? It can kind of go in different directions. And we've seen lots of players that at 18, we see it this year with our club in Denmark. We've seen young players where the beginning of the season, they don't even look like professional soccer players. And the end of the season, they're completely unrecognizable. And so like what happened, right? Right environment, right mentality, continued development, patience.
Well, we have a technical training center called Soccer Labs, and sometimes we get into these discussions of what development is. And what we'll get criticized for actually is that we are just focused 100% on the technical aspect. We don't worry about strategy. We don't worry about team play. We don't worry about any of those things that they're doing out on the field. And then what happens, we just turn the kids over to the field coach, and then they take care of that part of it. So it's a little different approach to development. So it's interesting to watch these things and then to also compare how they're doing it over in other countries where it seems like they do more of this technical training type of approach versus just scrimmaging 1v1s, 2v2s, rondos, that sort of thing. So let's take a quick look at that. When you look at your youth players in Europe, are they doing a lot more technical training where they are focused on ball mastery, on skills development, on things outside of team play?
Yes. They are on the pitch more. They have the ball at their feet more. For instance, us in Denmark, the youth, they have an arrangement with school. So the players will train in the morning before they go to school, and then train in the afternoon. So more time on the pitch, more time with the ball at your feet. So I think that's one main difference, is a little bit more of a holistic approach when it comes to education and how the development factors in. There's also in a place like Denmark and a lot of European countries, there's like talent identification centers in a lot of different geographic areas. So they can constantly be evaluating the players, bringing them into youth national team pools and making sure that they continue their development in that structure as well. So yes, there's a lot more going on than necessarily in the United States, where maybe a kid goes to soccer practice for an hour or two after school, and then they're going to go home and do other things. Like very much in Europe, it's really more professionalized, where it's soccer like 24/7.
Yeah. And if you look at some of the approaches to development outside of soccer, just in general, sometimes you'll get people that think they want to just do a very hardcore workout and say, okay, we can maximize our effort in this one area, and they go at it super hard for 2 hours. And then there's the other philosophy of, if you can do 200 push-ups in 2 hours, you can accomplish the same thing by doing 20 push-ups over 20 days. It's the same basic thing. And it sounds like what you're saying is that in those environments, they are just putting in a lot more time. Maybe it's not all high intensity time, but it's an hour a day, hour and a half a day, maybe even a half hour a day, but they're always getting their foot on the ball before school, after school, and then they're also doing practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a really good example. I have a good friend who's Danish, and he came out here to San Francisco because he's a visiting professor at University of San Francisco, and his son, who's 9 years old, plays at an academy for one of the bigger clubs. And when he was out here, every time I saw the son, whether he was at the playground, inside the apartment, outside the apartment, there was a soccer ball at his foot, and he was kicking a soccer ball. Now, can you teach that? Is that part of the like more formalized education of a player? Not really. I think part of that's just the cultural integration of the sport where he is growing up in and around the sport. He wants to be a part of that. So I think part of it is more cultural. There's only so much, youth academies and we can do. I think as the sport becomes more popular, hopefully over the next generation, we'll see more young American kids with that similar approach. Obviously, we're not quite there yet.
Let's talk about how somebody gets started, how they go down this pathway. How do people get involved if they want to start working with you, for example? What would they do?
I mean, I think certainly there's like kind of minimum barriers to entry. I think a player would probably have to go through a pretty high level American academy first and kind of prove themselves that they're of a professional caliber. It doesn't necessarily have to be an MLS academy, but we're looking for players when they become 18 or 19 that are on the radar of either the U.S. youth national team or potential professional contract in MLS club, maybe a USL club, potentially a player who goes to college and is a top performing college athlete. So, we're looking for kind of the minimum barriers. And of course, we get inquiries from players. Hey, I played high school soccer and I did a really good job. Like, of course, that's players not good enough to play in our environment in Europe, being honest and fair. So I think, it's understanding that you need to succeed, certainly to a certain extent, in the North American environment first before you look towards Europe, especially since it's more difficult to go over at a younger age. It's not to say you can't be a very good player at 18 and develop the rest of your game over a period of time in Europe, but most European clubs won't probably give you the time of day unless there's a minimum level saying, hey, we've seen tape, you scored 15 goals with the U19 MLS academy, or you were a member of the youth national teams with the United States, like whatever that is, there has to be something there.
Jordan, if somebody wants to get a hold of you and talk to you further, ask some questions, how do they reach you if they want to contact you directly?
I'm on Twitter at Mr. Jordan Gardner, my name. So feel free to send me a message if you have any questions. Always happy to answer any questions. Of course, whether it's on players moving to Europe or generally on investment in European soccer, I'm always happy to talk to anyone about that. But yeah, if you don't hesitate to reach out. Instagram as well, Mr. Jordan Gardner as well.
Jordan, I really appreciate you coming out this afternoon and giving us this advice and information about the European market. Really enjoyed the conversation. I hope that we can circle back and learn a little bit more from you in the future.
Thanks, Gary. Enjoyed the chat.